The rain fell like tears from heaven that November night, each drop carrying the weight of broken dreams and unanswered prayers. Marcus Webb stood at the gas station, his worn jacket soaked through, his calloused hands trembling not from cold but from fear. In 72 hours he would walk into a courtroom. In 72 hours, a judge would decide whether his daughter would remember her father as a free man or as a number in a prison system that chewed up men who looked like him and spit them out forgotten. He pumped gas into his ancient sedan, the one with the duct-taped mirror and the passenger door that only opened from the inside, and tried not to think about how everything had fallen apart. 6 months ago he'd been a maintenance supervisor at Riverside Medical Center. 6 months ago, he'd had steady work, health insurance, and hoped that maybe, just maybe, he could give his 8-year-old daughter Naomi the life his own mother had dreamed for him before cancer took her voice and then her breath. 6 months ago, before someone stole $73,000 from the hospital's renovation fund and made it look like Marcus had done it, the gas pump clicked off. Marcus replaced the nozzle and climbed back into his car, the vinyl seats cracked and splitting like the promises this world had made to him. He turned the key and the engine sputtered, coughed, then died. He tried again. Nothing. His hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went pale. Not tonight. Please, not tonight. He had $12 left until payday. $12 between his daughter and an empty refrigerator. He couldn't afford a tow truck. Couldn't afford a mechanic. Couldn't afford to be one more black man with car trouble in a neighborhood where police ask questions with their hands on their weapons. He laid his forehead against the steering wheel and felt something inside him crack. This was it. This was how men like him disappeared. One broken car, one missed shift, one unpaid bill, and suddenly you were drowning, and nobody threw you a rope because they were too busy deciding you deserved to sink. But then something made him look up. Through the rain-streaked windshield, past the blue, fluorescent glare of the gas station lights, he saw her. A woman, maybe 50, maybe older, standing beside a luxury sedan with her hand pressed to her temple like she was trying to hold herself together. Her sat with the hood up, steam rising into the rain, and she was alone. Completely, dangerously alone. Marcus should have looked away. Should have stayed in his dead car and minded his business, because every lesson his mother had taught him, every warning his grandfather had whispered, every news story that played on repeat in his mind said that black men who approached white women in parking lots after dark were asking for trouble, asking for handcuffs, asking for headlines. But something in the way she stood there, something in the defeated slope of her shoulders, reminded him of his mother in those final weeks. Proud and hurting, and too tired to ask for help. He opened his car door and stepped into the rain. Each step toward her felt like walking toward the edge of a cliff, but he kept walking anyway because this was who his mother had raised him to be. Someone who stopped. Someone who helped. Someone who chose compassion even when the world punished him for it. The woman turned as he approached, and he saw her body stiffen with fear. Saw her hand move toward her purse. Saw the calculation in her eyes as she measured distance and danger and every terrible thing the evening news had taught her to expect from men who looked like him. He stopped 10 feet away, raised both hands so she could see them clearly, and kept his voice gentle. "Ma'am, I don't mean any trouble. Just saw you were stranded, and thought maybe I could help." She studied him with eyes that had learned to read people, to measure truth from raw lies, and Marcus felt himself being weighed on scales he couldn't see. The rain plastered his thin jacket to his frame, making him look smaller than he was, more tired than his 34 years should allow. Finally she nodded. "The battery, I think. The car just died on me, and I have no idea what I'm doing under there." Marcus moved closer, careful to keep his movements slow and predictable. He looked under the hood and spotted the problem immediately. Corroded battery terminal loose. Connection. Simple fix if you had the right tools. He jogged back to his car, grabbed the toolkit his grandfather had given him 20 years ago, and returned to her vehicle. As he worked, cleaning corrosion and tightening connections with hands that knew how to fix broken things even when he couldn't fix his own broken life, he found himself talking to fill the silence. I'm Marcus. Marcus Webb. I work maintenance over at Riverside Medical. Well, I used to. Things got complicated. He didn't know why he was telling this stranger his troubles. Maybe because she was safe in her unknowing. Maybe because in 72 hours a judge would decide he was guilty, and he needed someone, anyone, to hear him say he wasn't. She listened, without interrupting, and there was something in her silence that felt different from the silence of people who had already decided who he was. When he finished with her battery and the engine roared back to life, she reached for her purse. How much do I owe you? He shook his head, water streaming down his face. Nothing, ma'am. Just glad I could help. She looked at him for a long moment, and Marcus saw something shift behind her eyes. Something that looked almost like recognition, though of what he couldn't say. You're a good man, Marcus Webb. I hope your troubles work out the way they should. Then she was gone, taillights disappearing into the rain, and Marcus was alone again with his dead car, and his daughter waiting at home, and a trial that a trial would decide if goodness mattered at all in a world that had already made up its mind about him. He never asked her name. Never learned that in 72 hours, she would hold his life in her hands like a verdict waiting to be spoken. 3 days later, Marcus sat in Division 7 of the county criminal court, wearing a borrowed suit that hung loose on his frame, and shoes he'd found at Goodwill with the price tag still inside. His court-appointed attorney, a young woman named Rachel Foster, who carried exhaustion in her eyes and an impossible caseload in her briefcase, sat beside him organizing papers that both of them knew wouldn't be enough. The prosecution had everything. Doctored financial records showing Marcus's signature on fraudulent renovation contracts. Email trails that appeared to come from his work account ordering supplies that never arrived. Bank statements showing mysterious deposits into an account that had his name on it, though he'd never opened it. Couldn't access it. It was thorough. Professional. The kind of frame-up that required resources and connections and the confidence that comes from knowing the system protects certain people while feeding others to it like fuel. Ms. Foster had fought for forensic examination of the digital evidence, had argued that the documents needed to be authenticated by experts, had pleaded for time to prove what she believed in her bones to be true, that Marcus was innocent and someone powerful was using him as a shield. But the previous judge had denied the motion, said the evidence was clear enough, said they couldn't waste the court's resources on speculation, said that sometimes people we think we know turn out to be exactly what the evidence says they are. Now, 3 days after helping a stranger in the rain while his own life fell apart, Marcus sat in a courtroom that smelled of old wood and broken promises, and waited for a new judge to decide his fate. All rise for the Honorable Judge. Catherine Blackwell, the bailiff announced. Marcus stood on legs that felt like water. Kept his eyes on the floor because if he looked up, if he saw the face of the person who would decide whether his daughter grew up with a father or grew up explaining why hers was gone, he thought he might shatter into pieces too small to ever put back together. But something made him glance up. Instinct, maybe. Or fate, deciding it was time to show its hand. The judge entered with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades measuring justice on scales that didn't always balance. She took her seat behind the bench, her dark suit impeccable, her silver-streaked hair pulled back with elegant severity, and Marcus felt the air leave his lungs. It was her. The woman from the gas station. The woman whose car he'd fixed. The woman who had looked at him like maybe, Just maybe. She could see past the color of his skin and the assumptions the world wrapped around men like him. She was the judge. She was the person who would decide if he was guilty or innocent, if he was a thief or a victim, if he deserved mercy or the full weight of a system that showed none to people who looked like him. Their eyes met for half a second, and Marcus saw something flicker across her face. Recognition. Shock. Something that might have been conflict or might have been resolve. Then her expression smoothed into professional neutrality, and she looked down at the case file like she'd never seen him before. Like 3 nights ago hadn't happened. Like he was just another defendant in just another case, and the small kindness between them had never existed at all. The prosecutor, a sharp-suited man named Daniel Morse, who had built a career on conviction rates and sound bites about being tough on crime, stood and began his opening statement. Your Honor, the evidence in this case is overwhelming. The defendant, Marcus Webb, systematically embezzled $73,000 from Riverside Medical Center's renovation fund over a period of 8 months. We have his signatures on fraudulent contracts, email communications from his work account, and bank deposits into an account bearing his name. This is not a case of mistaken identity or bad bookkeeping. This is deliberate theft by a man who was trusted with responsibility and betrayed that trust for personal gain. Miss Foster rose to respond, and Marcus heard the strain in her voice, the sound of someone fighting a battle she knew was already lost. Your Honor, my client maintains his complete innocence. The so-called evidence has never been properly authenticated. We've been denied forensic examination of the digital records. The bank account in question was opened without Mr. Webb's knowledge or consent. This is a frame-up, Your Honor, and we need time and resources to prove it. Judge Blackwell leaned forward, her eyes sharp as she examined the file before her. Miss Foster, I see that your motion for forensic examination was denied by Judge Morrison. Can you tell me why? Because Judge Morrison said it would be too expensive and time-consuming, Your Honor. He said the evidence was self-evident and didn't require expert analysis. Judge Blackwell was quiet. For a moment, her fingers steepled in front of her face. Then she spoke, and her voice carried the kind of authority that makes lawyers sit up straight. Mr. Morse, I've reviewed this file, and I have concerns. These documents you're presenting as evidence are all photocopies or printed emails. Where are the original hard drives? Where are the authenticated digital forensic? Where is the chain of custody for the so-called fraudulent bank account? Mr. Morse shifted his weight, clearly caught off guard. Your Honor, the previous judge found the evidence sufficient. We followed standard procedures. Standard procedures that apparently didn't include actually verifying the authenticity of digital evidence in a case involving alleged computer fraud. Judge Blackwell's voice had an edge now, sharp as broken glass. Mr. Morse, I'm not Judge Morrison. In my courtroom, we don't convict people based on printouts and assumptions. The courtroom went quiet. Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Miss Foster was gripping her pen so hard her knuckles had gone white. Judge Blackwell looked at Marcus then, really looked at him, and for a moment he saw something in her eyes that went beyond professional duty. Something that looked like determination. Or maybe justice, finally remembering what it was supposed to be. I'm ordering an immediate forensic examination of all digital evidence, Judge Blackwell announced. I'm also ordering the prosecution to produce the original documents, hard drives, and complete banking records related to this case. We will reconvene in 2 weeks. Until then, Mr. Webb, you remain on supervised release. Her gavel came down with a crack that sounded like thunder. Like deliverance. Like a door opening in a wall Marcus had thought was solid. As the courtroom cleared, Marcus remained seated, his mind spinning. Miss Foster was talking beside him, explaining what had just happened, how unusual it was, how this was the break they needed. But Marcus barely heard her. His eyes were on Judge Blackwell as she gathered her files. She glanced up once, met his gaze for a fraction of a second, and he saw it again. That flicker of recognition. That acknowledgement of a debt neither of them could name in it. Public. Then she was gone, disappearing into her chambers, and Marcus was left wondering if an act of kindness on a rainy night could somehow rewrite the ending of a story that seemed already written. Judge Catherine Blackwell closed her chamber door and leaned against it, her hand pressed to her chest where her heart was beating too fast. She was 53 years old, had been a judge for 17 years, had presided over hundreds of cases involving theft, fraud, assault, and worse. She had learned to maintain professional distance, had built walls between her personal feelings and her judicial duties, had trained herself to see evidence, not faces, facts, not stories. But standing in her chambers with Marcus Webb's case file open on her desk, those walls were crumbling. She knew that face, knew those hands that had fixed her car with duct tape tools while rain soaked through his thin jacket, knew that voice that had been gentle and careful and kind when he had every reason to be bitter. He had helped her when he had nothing, when he was 3 days away from a trial that could destroy his life, when his own car was broken and he was running on empty, and any rational person would have kept driving, would have minded their own business, would have protected themselves first. But he had stopped, had help, had refused payment from a woman who clearly had more resources than he could dream of, had smiled wearily and told her his name before disappearing into the rain, like some guardian angel in a borrowed jacket. And now, his life was in her hands. Catherine pressed her fingers to her temples. The ethical thing to do was recuse herself, to admit she knew the defendant, had interacted with him outside the same courtroom, had a personal reason to believe in his character that went beyond evidence and testimony. If she recused herself, the case would go to Judge Phillips, who had a 96% conviction rate and no patience for defendants who claimed they were framed. Judge Phillips would look at the printouts and the emails and the bank statements, would see a maintenance worker who got greedy, would hand down a sentence that would destroy Marcus Webb and everyone who loved him. Catherine looked at the case file again. Really looked at it this time, the way she should have looked before the hearing. The documents were suspicious. Photocopies instead of originals. Digital evidence that had never been forensically examined. A bank account that supposedly bore Marcus's name, but had been opened at a branch 30 miles from where he lived, at a time when time-stamped security footage from his workplace showed him at work. This wasn't just sloppy prosecution. This was deliberate. Someone had gone to significant trouble to frame Marcus Webb, and nobody had bothered to look closely because he was exactly the kind of defendant the system was designed to chew up and forget. A black man. Poor. Alone. Without the resources or connections to fight back. She thought about the man who had stopped in the rain. About the gentleness in his voice when he'd approached her. About the pride she'd seen in his eyes when he'd refused payment. About how he'd told her about his daughter, about working double shifts, about trying to be the parent his mother had raised him to be. That wasn't the profile of a thief. That was the profile of someone trying to survive in a system that punished survival as much as it punished crime. Catherine made her decision then, not as a judge, but as a human being who had been shown kindness when she needed it, and now had the power to return it. She wouldn't recuse herself. She would use her position to demand the forensic examination that should have been done from the start. She would force the prosecution to prove their case with real evidence, not assumptions and convenient paperwork. And if that meant bending ethical rules, if that meant risking her reputation, if that meant walking the line between justice and personal interest, then so be it. Because sometimes justice required impossible choices. Sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules that protected the wrong people. Sometimes mercy was more important than procedure. 2 weeks felt like 2 years. Marcus went through the motions of living, working his new job at a warehouse loading dock because the medical center had fired him the day the charges were filed, picking up Naomi from his neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who watched her after school, reading bedtime stories and pretending everything was fine. But every night he lay awake wondering what the forensic examination would find, wondering if the truth would be enough, wondering if a judge who had seen him at his most vulnerable, who had accepted his help without knowing what it would cost him, could possibly risk everything to save him. He wanted to believe kindness mattered, wanted to believe that stopping in the rain had been the right choice. But a lifetime of experience had taught him that good deeds didn't rewrite the rules, that mercy was a luxury reserved for people who didn't look like him, that hope was just another way of setting yourself up for disappointment. Then, on a Tuesday morning, while he was loading pallets onto a truck, his phone rang. It was Miss Foster, and her voice was shaking. "Marcus, the forensic report came in. It's everything we needed. Everything." The emails were sent from an IP address that traces to a computer in it. The hospital's administrative wing, not from your workstation. The bank account was opened using a forged ID that has your name, but someone else's photograph. The digital signatures on the contracts were created using software that lifted your actual signature from legitimate documents. Someone went to extraordinary lengths to frame you, and the forensics prove it conclusively. Marcus's legs gave out. He sat down hard on a stack of boxes, phone pressed to his ear, tears streaming down his face. Who would do this to me? The report doesn't say, but Ms. Foster, if we cross-reference the building access logs with the times the fraudulent emails were sent, I think we'll find our answer. Judge Blackwell has ordered an expedited hearing for tomorrow morning. She wants to resolve this immediately. Tomorrow. Marcus closed his eyes and felt something that hadn't lived in his chest for 6 months beginning to unfurl. Not quite hope, not yet, but maybe the possibility of hope. Maybe the beginning of an ending that didn't crush him. The courtroom was packed the next morning. Word had spread somehow that something unusual was happening, that a case everyone thought was open and shut was about to crack wide open. Marcus sat at the war defense table wearing the same borrowed suit, but this time, his hands weren't shaking. This time Miss Foster sat beside him with a stack of documents and a fire in her eyes that said she was ready to fight. Mr. Morse stood at the prosecution table, looking like a man who had just realized he'd bet on the wrong horse. Judge Blackwell entered, and Marcus looked at her fully this time. Saw the intelligence in her dark eyes, the strength in the set of her jaw, the absolute authority that came from someone who had spent a lifetime earning respect in rooms that didn't want to give it. She looked at him, and for just a moment, their eyes met with the weight of understanding. "Miss Foster," Judge Blackwell said, "please present your findings." What followed was 2 hours of detailed forensic testimony that took apart the prosecution's case piece by piece. Computer experts explaining how the fraudulent emails had been created. Handwriting analysts showing how signatures had been forged. Banking investigators demonstrating how the account had been opened using fake identification that wouldn't have fooled anyone who actually looked. And then came the name. Thomas Crawford, senior administrator at Riverside Medical Center. The man who had authorized Marcus's hiring. The man who had access to the renovation fund. The man who had been 3 months from retirement with a gambling debt that would have destroyed his pension. He had stolen the money, had created an elaborate frame-up, had chosen Marcus as his fall guy because Marcus was exactly the kind of person nobody would question, nobody would defend, nobody would believe. A black maintenance worker, with no connections and no resources. Disposable. Forgettable. Easy. Judge Blackwell listened to it all with a face carved from stone. When the testimony concluded, she looked at Mr. Morse with eyes that could cut glass. Mr. Morse, does the prosecution wish to proceed with this case? Morse stood slowly, and Marcus saw the writhing defeat in the slope of his shoulders. No, Your Honor. In light of the forensic evidence, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Marcus Webb. Judge Blackwell nodded once, sharp and final. Motion granted. Mr. Webb, all charges against you are hereby dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the district attorney with a strong recommendation that charges be immediately filed against Thomas Crawford for embezzlement, fraud, forgery, and obstruction of justice. Hurry, pass. Gavel came down with the sound of doors opening, of chains breaking, of justice, finally, impossibly, arriving. Courtroom erupted in noise, but Marcus heard none of it. He was crying, hands covering his face, shoulders shaking with relief so profound it felt like grief. Miss Foster's hand on his shoulder. Strangers congratulating him. The weight of 6 months of terror, lifting like a physical thing. He looked up through tears at Judge Blackwell. She was gathering her files with Wade. Professional efficiency. Preparing to leave. But before she did, she looked at him one last time. And in her eyes, Marcus saw acknowledgement. Saw the answer to a question he hadn't dared to ask. She had known who he was from the beginning. Remembered the rain-soaked man who stopped to help. Had used her power to demand the investigation that should have happened from the start. Had risked her reputation to save someone who had saved her first. She gave the slightest nod, a gesture, so small that nobody else in the courtroom would have noticed. Then she was gone. Black robes disappearing through the door, and Marcus was left standing in a courtroom full of people celebrating his freedom, knowing that kindness had been returned in a way he never could have imagined. 6 weeks passed like a dream. Marcus found a better job as a facilities supervisor at a community college, better pay and benefits and hours that meant he could be home for dinner with Naomi. He bought new clothes that fit and got his car properly fixed and started sleeping through the night without dreams of prison bars and lost years. Life was good in ways he had forgotten were possible. But something nagged at him. He had never properly thanked the judge. Had never confirmed what he knew in his heart, that she had recognized him, had remembered him, had chosen to risk everything rather than watch an innocent man be destroyed by a system that didn't care about truth. One Saturday afternoon, Marcus was shopping for supplies to fix Naomi's bookshelf when he turned down an aisle and stopped. There she was, Judge Blackwell. Though today she wasn't Judge Blackwell. Today she was just Catherine, a woman in jeans and a sweater, her silver-streaked hair down around her shoulders, standing in the home improvement store looking at paintbrushes like she had all the time in the world. "It's you," Marcus said, and his voice came out rough with emotion. She turned, and when she saw him, her face transformed, with a smile that was warmer and more genuine than anything he'd seen in the courtroom. "Marcus Webb, I was wondering if our paths would cross again." "You knew," Marcus said, taking a step closer. "In the courtroom, you knew who I was the whole time. From the moment I saw your photograph in the case file," Catherine said quietly. "I recognized you immediately." Marcus felt tears sting his eyes. "You could have recused yourself. Sent my case to another judge." She nodded. "I should have. Ethically, I absolutely should have. But Judge Phillips would have convicted you. He has no patience for defendants who claim they're framed, no interest in digging deeper. He would have looked at the surface evidence and handed down a sentence that would have destroyed your life and your daughter's future." So you risked your career, Marcus whispered. Your reputation. Everything. Catherine's eyes were steady on his. That night at the gas station, you stopped when you had every reason to keep driving. You helped when you had nothing. You showed me kindness when you were 72 hours away from a trial that terrified you. You did the right thing when nobody would have blamed you for protecting yourself first. Her voice softened. How could I do any less? They stood in the home improvement store, surrounded by the mundane materials of ordinary life, and the moment felt sacred. Marcus thought about all the ways this story could have ended. All the ways the system was designed to crush men like him. Pain. All the ways kindness was supposed to be weakness in a world that rewarded cruelty. But here they were. Two people who had chosen compassion over convenience, who had stopped when stopping was dangerous, who had risked something precious to protect someone they barely knew. Thank you, Marcus said, and the words felt too small for the magnitude of what he meant. Thank you for seeing me, for believing me, for using your power to demand truth instead of convenience. You saved my life. You saved mine first, Catherine said softly. You reminded me why I became a judge, why I spent years fighting for a seat behind that bench. Not to process cases efficiently, not to maintain conviction rates, but to ensure that justice means something, that truth matters, that people like you, people with integrity and kindness and courage, don't get ground up by a system that's supposed to protect them. They exchanged phone numbers that day, started meeting for coffee, conversation that had nothing to do with courtrooms and everything to do with discovering each other as whole people beyond the roles they'd played in each other's stories. Marcus learned that Catherine had grown up poor herself, had put herself through law school working 3 jobs, had spent her career fighting to reform a system that punished poverty as severely as it punished crime. Catherine learned about Naomi's love of science, about Marcus's dreams of becoming a teacher someday, about the mother who had raised him to believe in goodness, even when the world gave him every reason not to. Their friendship grew into something deeper, something that looked like love, though neither of them rushed to name it. Something built on mutual respect and shared understanding and the knowledge that they had both chosen kindness, when kindness came at a cost. 8 months after the trial, Marcus introduced Catherine to Naomi, and his daughter fell in love with the woman who had saved her daddy with what she called a magic hammer of justice. A year after that, Catherine attended Naomi's 10th birthday party and sat in Marcus's small apartment surrounded by neighbors and friends and laughter, feeling more at home than she had in years. 2 years after the BIS trial, on a Saturday evening when the sky was painted orange and gold, Marcus took Catherine back to that gas station, to the place where their paths had first crossed, where a broken car and a rainy night and a choice to stop had changed both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. I want you to know, Marcus said, holding her hand. That night, when I stopped to help you, I was so scared. Scared of being seen as a threat. Scared of being misunderstood. Scared that doing the right thing would somehow be used against me. But I stopped anyway, because my mother taught me that fear doesn't excuse cruelty. That being hurt doesn't justify hurting others. That kindness is never wasted, even when it's not returned. Catherine squeezed his hand, tears in her eyes. Your mother raised someone extraordinary. I wish I could have known her. She would have liked you, Marcus said with a smile. She would have said you have the kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself. The kind that shows up when it matters most. They stood there as the sun set, 2 people who had each held the other's fate in their hands and chosen mercy over judgment, compassion over convenience, truth over the comfortable lie. The world around them continued in its imperfect, complicated way. Injustice still happened. Good people still suffered. The systems that were supposed to protect still failed more often than they succeeded. But in that moment, in that place where their story had begun, Marcus and Catherine were proof that sometimes kindness circles back. That sometimes the person you help when you have nothing becomes the person who saves you when you need it most. That sometimes, against all odds and in defiance of how the world usually works, doing the right thing actually matters. What can we learn from this story that unfolded between a gas station and a courtroom, between a man on the edge of losing everything and a woman with the power to save or condemn? Perhaps the most profound lesson is the simplest one. You never know whose life you're touching when you choose kindness. That stranger you help might be the person who one day holds your fate in their hands. That small act of compassion might be the seed of justice that grows when you need it most. But that's not why we should be kind. We should be kind because it's right. Because every human being carries invisible burdens, fights invisible battles, needs invisible grace. Because the measure of who we are isn't found in what we do when people are watching, but in what we choose when we're alone in the rain with every reason to drive past someone else's trouble. Marcus Webb could have kept driving. Should have kept driving if he was thinking about self-preservation and risk and all the ways the world punishes black men who make white women uncomfortable. But he stopped because his mother had raised him to see people, not categories. To respond to need, not fear. To understand that humanity is a circle, not a hierarchy, and that we're all just walking each other home. Judge Catherine Blackwell could have recused herself. Should have recused herself if she was following the letter of ethical rules designed to keep personal feelings out of our professional judgments. But she stayed because she understood that sometimes the spirit of justice requires breaking the rules written to protect the comfortable. That sometimes mercy matters more than procedure. That sometimes seeing someone clearly is more important than maintaining professional distance. Their story is not a fairy tale. It's not a promise that goodness always wins, or that the system rewards integrity, or that justice magically appears when you need it. The world doesn't work that way. Too many people like Marcus never get their exoneration. Too many people with power never use it to protect the vulnerable. Too many stories end with the wrong verdict, the undeserved sentence, the innocent person destroyed by convenient lies. But this story is proof that it can happen. That sometimes, against the odds, humanity breaks through. That sometimes the circle of kindness completes itself in ways we never see coming. That sometimes doing the right thing, even when it costs you, plants seeds that bloom in the most unexpected places. Think about the people you encounter every day. The clerk at the store who's having a bad day. The driver whose car broke down. The neighbor struggling with burdens you can't see. The stranger who needs help that would cost you nothing but a few minutes of compassion. You don't know who they are. Don't know what battles they're fighting. Don't know if they're 72 hours from a trial that will destroy their life or 24 hours from a diagnosis that will change everything or 3 weeks from losing hope entirely. But you have a choice. You can drive past, can protect yourself, can decide that everyone else's trouble is not your problem and you have enough of your own. Or you can stop, can help, can offer the small kindness that seems insignificant in the moment, but might be the difference between someone surviving and someone going under. Marcus stopped in the rain with a car that didn't work and a trial that terrified him and a daughter waiting at home, and that choice saved his life when he needed it most. Not because he expected anything in return, not because he knew it would matter, but because he was raised to believe that we're all connected, that other people's suffering is our suffering, that turning away from someone in need diminishes us all. This is not about karma or cosmic balance or the universe rewarding good behavior. This is about recognizing that we're all human beings stumbling through a complicated world, and the small mercies we show each other are what keep the darkness from consuming everything. It's about understanding that systems fail, that justice is often blind to the people who need it most, that the vulnerable are ground up by machinery that's supposed to protect them. But people who can choose differently can use whatever power they have, whether it's the power to fix a stranger's car, or the power to demand forensic examination of evidence, to create small pockets of grace in an often graceless world. If this story touched something in you, if it made you think about the strangers you've passed, and the moments you've driven by and the choices you make when nobody's watching, then it has done its work. Share it with someone who needs to remember that kindness matters. That dignity is not determined by bank accounts or zip codes or the color of skin. That we all have the power to change someone's story if we're brave enough to stop. Subscribe to hear more stories that reveal the truth about humanity. The uncomfortable truths about systems that fail. The beautiful truths about people who choose compassion. The complicated truths about justice that sometimes requires impossible choices from ordinary people. Leave a comment telling us about a time when someone showed you unexpected kindness, or a time when you stopped when you could have kept driving. Your story matters. Your choices matter. Your humanity, offered freely, even when it costs you, matters more than you know. Because every story hides a truth. The truth that we're not as separate as we think we are. That the person you help today might be the person who saves you tomorrow. That the world is not divided into categories of worthy and unworthy, deserving and disposable, but into human beings trying to survive, trying to hope, trying to believe that goodness still exists somewhere. And every truth deserves to be heard. The truth that Marcus Webb learned on a rainy night and a judge named Catherine Blackwell proved in a courtroom. That stopping when you could drive past, helping when you could turn away, seeing someone when the world wants you to look through them, these are not small things. These are the things that make us human. These are the things that save us all.